Hello everybody, this lecture is on transnationalism and care work. This particular lecture goes alongside a lot of the topics from really last week on transnationalism and really enters us in or starts us in with this discussion of care work. So for people who study work, and particularly sociologists, theorists have sort of argued that there were sort of three great epochs that we're really looking at, and three different categories, if you will, of how we understand society and work. Theorists like Emil Durkheim really focused on the first two stages, agriculture, transitioning into the industrialized city. In addition to Durkheim, you also had people like Max Weber, as well as Karl Marx, who are very instrumental in theorizing what happens to society as people move into cities, as people's lives are so much more centered around work rather than family. Now, Durkheim really focused on this idea that in agricultural times, all production, all work was really centered around the family. In other words, in order to survive, families were really the locus of where all work happened. So think about, for example, for those of us who may have read the Little House on the Prairie novels or watched the old TV shows, the idea here was that every family had to subsist on its own. So that meant it had to do the planting, it had to work the fields, and it had to harvest what they needed. They had to if they wanted meat, they needed to go hunting. If you needed warmer clothes or blankets, you either had to sew it yourself or trade for it. But the idea here is that the family was really the center of everything. And so all work was done, and all production, more importantly, was done in the context of the family. And then slowly over time, what we began to see is a shift away from agriculture and a move into cities, and in particular, the industrialized cities. The industrialized cities were factory cities. Everything focused around factory lives. That people began to work within different factories to produce what they needed. So you would have some factories focused on papers, others that would be like meat packing plants. Others would do sort of large-scale distribution, but the idea is that people began to specialize. Specialization was a core component of the industrialized cities. And when you think about industrialized cities, you'll think about things like Detroit or Flint, Michigan, where you had the whole automobile industry. And then, in fact, you had entire cities built around the automobile factory. You could go to places like North or South Carolina, where there was a huge textile industry, as well as industry built around making furniture. You had entire cities that were built around those particular factories, right? And then as you move forward, what you began to see is that you then enter the era of the global city, which is where we're at now, which is really more characterized by technology, fast production. We don't really live factory lives because everything has been sent overseas, that really everything's controlled by technology, and that you actually see different types of work, which I'll go into a little bit later in this lecture. These transitions, though, weren't easy, and I think that's important to note, that these transitions were not just transitions of the economy and production practices, but they were also about shifts in social mores and how people related to one another. So as you go from agricultural society to industrialized city, Durkheim posited that society went through this stage of what he called anomie. Anomie was basically social chaos. This particular time period was characterized by sort of a loss of values, that people didn't really know how to attach to one another because the family was devalued, but you hadn't really associated yourself with a factory or work yet. You had a crisis of morality. The idea here is that you lost your religiosity, you lost your faith, and that this particular time period was characterized by high levels of crime, high levels of suicide, which really talked to this idea of sort of a loss of self. And this was sort of a big part of Durkheim's theory. And then as we transition from the industrialized city to the global city, there was a shift economically away from the factory. As we've talked about already, deindustrialization meant that factories that had once been the centerpiece of cities, that work was sent out of the country, to places like China, to Mexico, to other countries in South America, where production work, it was cheaper to do the production over there and import the goods back to the United States. So deindustrialization changed the natures of cities. Some cities were able to rebuild and others were not. Los Angeles, being one of the cities that was able to rebuild, shifted towards that global city where you had an infrastructure that was developed, and that infrastructure really was a technological one that allowed for the fast-paced moving of capital, namely money, over communication lines like the internet at very high speeds. And it also had the ability to import what we needed very quickly and then distribute it to other areas. And the global city isn't just about high technology, but it was the restructuring of the workforce. What was restructured on the one hand for a global city when you're working in high finance, quick production, everything's controlled by computers, is that you needed a highly educated workforce. You needed a workforce of professionals who were able to manage the new means of production, who could work across countries in the blink of an eye, or their work would be characterized by travel if need be. But simultaneously, for people working in those industries, you also needed services to help them in their daily lives. This is everything from dry cleaning to maids and nannies and housekeepers. For those who might have relatives or loved ones who have chronic illnesses, it was also about home health care work. And here you begin to see the rise of what we call the service sector. The service sector is really what we're starting to look at now. Those who provide goods and services, and I'm focusing on a very specific group that provide what we call care work. Those which is about caring for individuals, right, that before would have been taken care of directly by their families. Just to make sure we have some baseline definitions, deindustrialization refers to a process of social and economic change caused by the removal or reduction of industrial capacity or activity, namely factories and factory work in a country or region. Often connected with outsourcing of work to other regions of countries. In other words, what we talk about outsourcing is removing it from that particular area. And one big area, as I've already mentioned, the automobile industry, the paper industry, a lot of the clothing manufacturing have all been sent overseas, textiles, etc., for cheaper production. Even in today's day and age, things like technical support for your computers, like if you use a Dell computer. If you need help, that has largely been outsourced to India and other parts of the world, who will then help walk you through the process of fixing your computer on the phone lines. Now, global cities, right? This is also a very specific phenomenon and set of theories situated around globalization, which you may have studied in other classes. And I think really what I want to do is focus on, number one, the cities as a site where work is happening. I think it's important to paint a context for how a city becomes restructured, because it also impacts the way in which we work. A city acts as a focus for a global city is one that acts as a focus for world finance and trade flows, both in terms of money, stocks, and bonds, but sometimes also physical goods. 25 cities effectively control almost all the world's financial transactions, with New York, London, and Tokyo at the top of that hierarchy. And this was in 1994. Other areas include Kuala Lumpur. You'll also look at Shanghai now, and Los Angeles are also in that list. Cities become the locus for global capital. In other words, it isn't a country that now holds the wealth, it is very specific cities that hold wealth. In terms of work, Saskia Sassen, who is one of the foremost theories on globalization and global cities, argues that global cities are witnessing large-scale immigration because migration to rich countries is partly set in motion by flows of foreign direct investment. Sites of increasing disparities in income. They are also sites of increasing disparities in income and occupation, because increased earning inequality, together with sharply inflated prices for business inputs, commercial space, and labor, all collide. Inequalities have led to informalization. Now, what we mean by informalization here is that you begin to see people who are seeking services at a cheaper price. So you're not looking at a sort of a strict supply and demand type of situation like you do with goods, where if supplies are restricted, you necessarily have prices go up. But what you begin to see happening, even particularly with care work, is that wages get depressed. The global city, according to Sasson, shifts. What you begin to see is a shift in the organization of labor markets and who works in each type of jobs. So specifically, you have professionals who are generally highly educated, possess specialized skills. These are people like engineers or technical workers, computer information systems workers, right? They have very specific processes, right? And even now, we begin to see a lot of those professionals being moving to other areas. We're even outsourcing those types of jobs now. But largely, these professionals run the larger global economy. You have the second area of work that has been restructured is really civil service or government work. And then finally, you have the service sector and the informal economy. This is domestics, janitors, restaurant workers, gardeners, etc. People who take care of the houses and homes and the lives of your professionals. The informal economy refers to people who are paid under the table, who don't pay taxes. This can range from people like street vendors to people who don't pay taxes, who aren't having Social Security or taxes taken out of whatever they're paid to do, whether that is cleaning houses or taking care of kids. Post-Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, you had a first wave of immigrants, particularly from Europe and Asia, who were students and professional immigrants. I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, that usually your first group of immigrants tend to be much more highly educated. And as they sponsor family members over, you then have a second wave of Asian and Latino immigrants who fell largely into the service sector work, working the jobs that traditionally African Americans had held prior to 1965. These immigrants filled the niche of nannies, housekeepers, gardeners, butlers, etc. And what we began to see post 65 was African American workers moved in large numbers into civil service. Now, this does not mean that African Americans and whites don't work in these industries. In fact, they do. But this is what we meant in terms of when globalization and global cities first began to develop. You saw a whole restructuring of the workforce. But we do know that the current workforce in the service sector is largely dominated by immigrant workers. Immigrants change the social dynamics of work. As we've talked about earlier, particularly when we're talking about agricultural work, earlier waves of immigrants had been sojourners or journeyman workers. In other words, they came, they planned to work, and they wanted to go back home. But there's been so many shifts in both labor and immigration policy that we've stopped seeing what we call the ebb and flow to migration. No longer do we have people who come here and work seasonally, but they've actually been forced to stay. Because as we've seen, in an immigration class, I've talked about this at much greater length, with the militarization of the border, which effectively is about building border walls. And we've extended the wall as far into the desert. We've also extended the height. But walls don't only keep people out, they keep people in. And so that's also effectively changed the demographics of the workforce of the United States. So that when people make the very dangerous journey to the United States, particularly if they do not have documents, it is very hard for them to return. I think it is also important to note, particularly post-1992 forward, there's been this huge backlog at ICE, formerly known as the INS, in processing visas. So, for example, if you're Filipino and wanted to sponsor your sister here to the United States, if you submitted the paperwork today, it would take 19 years to get your sister here. The numbers are equally high for El Salvador, Mexico, and other areas. Unless you can prove that you have $500,000 in the bank, it is next to impossible to expedite that visa. So when you look at the visa process and how hard it is, and that economic survival for families often require moving here to the States, as is noted in some of the readings, what you find is that people make the decision to migrate without papers. Now, as they migrate, we're also seeing what we're beginning to see, and what is highlighted in both the movie you watched, as well as the transnational motherhood paper that you read. That what you begin to see is the creation of a new type of family. It's called a transnational family. This refers to migrants who leave families, usually spouses or children, in their country of origin, in order to find work to support them. Migrants traditionally send remittances, and migrants are both women and men, young and old, and have varying relationships of kinship to the remittance recipients. So sometimes it's mothers and fathers who are sending money back to the grandparents or their siblings who are taking care of their kids. Sometimes it is the oldest of the kids who are sending money back to their parents. It varies in very different ways. Orozco notes in her research changes that transnational families, what we begin to see is that how we understand those relationships changes vastly. You see changes in interactions and relationships within families, and it's created very traumatic family relations. Often children or those who are left behind feel abandoned. There are reported cases of abandonment of spouses. And families often live in poverty and struggle, not just in the United States, but also back in their country of origin. Migrants often exhibit high levels of stress, and family members often feel abandoned, isolated, and neglected. Sorry, I just repeated myself. So I think one of the things I really want you to think about is part of what I'm trying to paint here and ask you to do from a more humanistic perspective is to really think about how migration and how care work begins to reshape how we think about these transnational mothers. In what ways do you think do the immigrant workers depicted in Hanu Sotela's article lead transnational lives? How did individuals in the movie lead transnational lives? How is family redefined in a transnational context? And what social and emotional toll does it take on the lives of these workers? I also want you to think a little bit about the contradictions that are implicit in being a care worker. That if you're caring for children, but you've left your children in your country of origin, what kind of emotional toll does it take on that worker? What does it say to their families? And how does it restructure our social lives? Now, I will next week we'll focus more on the idea of organizing in this context. But I think before we could talk about organizing groups, we need to understand some of the context of their lived experience. And that's why I've been focusing on transnational motherhood and the idea of care work. So think about it as you're moving forward through the reading.